All right, good evening. We should get started with your reviews so you guys are able to move on to whatever you're doing tonight. If you are any of my intramural basketball players, good luck this evening. I'm sorry I won't be there this week, but I will be there next week once I get done coaching my boy tonight and going to my daughter's concert. So feel free to keep the questions coming. I've got your chat going on my phone, and so I'll hang with you guys, and we'll try to knock out as many questions as we can. But please make sure that you, again, are representing your own identity. Put down your first initial, last name, and keep the questions to where we want to be so we can get through as many of these as possible before people have to take off. So starting with the first question, can I explain the Homestead Strike? This is 1892. It's a strike against Andrew Carnegie at his steel mill. And what this is meant to show you is there's a term we use called laissez-faire economics, the idea of hands-off business and a lack of regulation, which is supposed to allow a free market to work. What we typically find when we look at these chapters, though, is that's kind of a myth as far as how the government was operating. Oftentimes, the government would step in and do things in a very pro-business way to crush unions and strikes so that they weren't causing trouble for the business owners. And this is one of those examples where at the Homestead Strike, you had strikers who were mad at Andrew Carnegie because their pay was low, conditions were terrible, work lives were awful. And so they went on strike, and essentially a mini war broke out in 1892, where the workers were being attacked by the owners of the steel mill and the military troops that had been sent to reinforce them. And so the Union was destroyed inside the Homestead Mill, and their resistance was crushed. And so this is kind of the pattern you see in the 1800s, that workers are expected to work inside the factory without trouble, and if they do cause trouble by striking, then they run a really good chance of being attacked. Next question is is about the grandfather clause. Grandfather clause is just something that's used to get around the literacy tests that were being used to prevent African Americans from voting. The grandfather clause is essentially, if you've got a grandpa who could vote before the Civil War, you don't have to do a literacy test. And the only people who had that going on were white Southerners prior to the Civil War. So if you're white, good chance you don't need to take a literacy test. If you are African American, you didn't have a grandpa voting before the Civil War, and so you're stuck. The next question is about ex parte Milligan. This is a question that a lot of kids end up having each and every year. There's two different court cases that are ruled by the Supreme Court, ex parte Milligan and ex parte Merriman. And the two of them are related, where the Supreme Court determined that when there's a war going on, they tried to limit what the president was able to do in suspending people's rights during the war. This was Chief Justice Taney. He's the Dred Scott decision guy who was very pro-Southern. And so when Buchanan and Lincoln were starting the Civil War, they were doing things like suspending habeas corpus, or the right to a speedy trial. And in ex parte Merriman, that's going to be determined as being unconstitutional. But Lincoln decided to ignore that decision by the Supreme Court because he had bigger things to worry about. So he was willing to lock people up in jail and prevent them from having a right to a speedy trial because he felt like it was necessary for national security. Ex parte Milligan is related to that because when they did finally start doing trials, some people who were suspected of being conspirators for the Confederacy, they were put on trial in front of a military tribunal instead of being put on trial in a civilian court. Constitutionally, that's never supposed to happen. But Lincoln was a little bit nervous that if these guys got on trial in front of a jury in Maryland, they might get set free, even though they're Confederate sympathizers who might be trying to blow up our bridges and other sorts of things. And so in ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court tried to change the way the president was behaving, and the president challenged that because he figured that in times of war, he should have the ability to suspend some people's rights because they are enemies of our country. That's still being debated nowadays. Who are the scalawags? There are two terms in your textbook you should know about for Southerners. A scalawag is a Southern Republican who hasn't been public about their Republicanism until after the Civil War is done. And now that there's a military present, these scalawags are going to come out, try to help African Americans, try to get elected, and they think that they're safe. And unfortunately for them, they're going to be some of the first people who are lynched when the military leaves in the 1870s, especially after 1877. The other group is carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers are Northern Republicans who pack their carpet suitcase So it's just a fabric suitcase, really cheap, and they move into the South to try to get African Americans to vote for them so they can take positions of power. Both these groups are over-exaggerated by Southerners who want to make it out as being a gigantic Republican conspiracy to take over the South. But both these groups are attempting to try to take power for sometimes the right reasons. Some of them are Gilded Age politicians who are there for precisely the wrong reasons and very corrupt reasons. But both are going to be hated by Southerners when Reconstruction ends. Let me see here. Next question is about the Tweed Ring. And so we talked about political machines. And remember, you had these political machines who would be led by bosses who would have a team of politicians that they would want to get elected. And they would use immigrants to get those politicians into positions of power. And the whole purpose was graft. You had these political machine bosses who would try to get their politicians into office so that they could then fulfill contracts or do jobs for the government. And they could charge way more money than what the project should actually cost in order to be able to make some money on the side for themselves. These bosses do some things to help out immigrants, but not a ton compared to the amount of money they're stealing from the government. There are both Republican and Democrat political machines, but by far the Democratic political machines with the immigrants coming in are going to build a power base there, especially in many major big cities. Next question is, what exactly did the radical Republicans want? The radical Republicans are going to be in power until the mid-1870s. And what they want is they want to force a Reconstruction onto the South that will improve the conditions for African Americans. Most importantly, they want African Americans to get to write the vote. They are very much wanting to have a slow Reconstruction so that they don't add the states back very quickly, because if they're added back quickly, they could then resist any attempts to try to reconstruct in a meaningful sort of way. And so they're trying to figure out ways to punish the Southern Confederates, help out the African Americans with like the Freedmen's Bureau, military protection, the right to vote. And their impeachment of Andrew Johnson is going to instead end up discrediting for them. They'll look too radical, and they're going to end up losing their position of power. They're going to be replaced by those Republicans that we've been spending time talking about the past couple days. Those are the conservative Republicans, pro-business, Gilded Age, and they really don't have many cares about Reconstruction. The Redeemers are the next question. Who were they? The Redeemers are white Southern Democrats who want to bring back what the South used to be, even though slavery is now technically illegal. And so working within what the federal government rules are with the amendments, they want to figure out ways to still go back to being a segregated society, a powerful part of society. So cotton's still going to remain a huge element of that, but they're also going to start building factories and industrializing to become more modern. What was the Pendleton Act? Pendleton Act and the other question, what is patronage? The two are related with one another. So patronage is part of the spoil system, and it's the idea that when you get to be president, you get to give away all the jobs to the people that helped you along the way. You serve as their patron if you are the president who just got elected, or you're the person taking care of all the people who helped you get elected. So if you have James Garfield, like he had Charles Guiteau show up to his office asking for a job, he's seeking patronage, or he wants to get a job for being a Garfield supporter. The Pendleton Act came after Garfield's assassination, though, during Arthur's presidency, where it said there are certain jobs that are so important that there should be some sort of civil service test to determine, do you know your politics, do you know your history, do you know basic mathematics, English, those sorts of things, so that you can actually pull off the job that you're being asked to do. Let me see here. Military Reconstruction of 1867. Military Reconstruction is just essentially, instead of having state-by-state Reconstruction, they wanted to instead have regions that the military would be controlling of multiple states. And then while the military was there, they were supposed to be suppressing the KKK, protecting African Americans, getting them the right to vote because it's mandated by federal law. And this is going to be the military Reconstruction that you hear about when we get to 1877. A decade later, when Reconstruction ends with Hayes' election, that's going to be what's ended, is pulling the military out, who has been the only people really protecting African Americans in the South and the rights that they're supposed to have after the Civil War is done. Next question, what was the corruption involving Fisk and Gould? That was the gold scheme that we talked about in class. where these two guys were already running monopolies. They already were fantastically wealthy, and they wanted to figure out a way to corner the gold market so that if you were going to buy gold, you'd have to buy it from their monopoly that they had been able to build up by bribing Grant's brother-in-law so he wouldn't sell gold into the open market. These two guys are using the ability to bribe the government in a way to hopefully make themselves rich. And so that's what they're up to. They're behaving very much like other monopolies during this time period of trying to figure out ways to game the system, become more wealthy. What was the goal for the factions in both parties during the Gilded Age? Both the parties are very similar to one another. And so if you remember, we talked about how you had liberals on the left, Republicans, conservatives on the right, Democrats, and we saw them move very closely together in the 1800s. You saw a number of reformers like the mugwumps and the half-breeds move from the Republican Party, which now, during the Gilded Age, Democrats and Republicans became almost the same. But there are some reform Republicans who come back to becoming more liberal to trying to figure out ways to reform the government. You also have some Democrats who are going to be influenced by the populists to also move in a more liberal or radical direction as they're trying to add like silver money, greenbacks, government aid to help out farmers because the farmers are so desperate and they are on the verge of possibly going bankrupt. So we see a lot of movement with some groups of Republicans and Democrats, even though most of them are locked in the center for laissez-faire economics, pro-business, hands-off any sort of regulation, and that's pretty much the place that they're going to be. Let me see here. Next question. Can you explain what carpetbag scalawags were? We got that one taken care of. Who was William Jennings Bryan? William Jennings Bryan is going to be much more important when we move to chapter 26 right after we return from winter break. He is going to be a young presidential candidate who is going to run for the Populist Party in the 1896 election against William McKinley, the guy that you read about who is creating like the McKinley Tariff and other sorts of laws during the Harrison presidency. The two of them are going to battle because what Bryan is going to do is he's going to bring together the Democratic Party and the Farmers Populist Party, and the two of them are going to be very much influenced by the idea of wanting to make silver their key issue. And so the silver standard or bimetallism is going to be their single issue that they're pushing for in the 1896 election. Bryan's going to lose in 1896. He's going to lose again in 1900, but a lot of his radical ideas will be embraced during the Teddy Roosevelt presidency. So not everything that he's pushing for doesn't get lost because they lose. He's leading a group of farmers whose issue is so narrow that if they're trying to add silver to the money supply, a lot of workers inside the factories aren't going to really dig that idea. What were the effects of the inability of the Populist Party to overcome the division between white and black farmers? It was huge. When you're looking at the reason why that falls apart, a lot of those farmers' alliances are going to be undermined by Southern Democrats who don't really like the farmers being a strong base together, resisting what the traditional Democrats have been up to. And so what a lot of traditional Southern Democrats start doing is when they see white poor farmers and African-American sharecroppers working together inside the alliances, many of those traditional Southern Democrats will start laying on the racism pretty thick to convince many of those poor white Southern farmers that this is the wrong idea for them. And they're going to end up dividing that group, which could have had a pretty serious power base, but they end up not getting that because the racism is much more important to them than the political movement that they're pushing for. What importance did the purchase of Alaska have? The purchase of Alaska during this time period has a very limited impact. It does encourage the idea of westward expansion. We are about to move into a time period of imperialism where America is going to get the idea that now that we are taking over the entire continental United States, perhaps we should expand further outwards. So Alaska is going to be one piece of that. It'll be Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam. We start moving into those territories, and Alaska is one of those first pieces. And the other thing to tune into with Alaska is it's going to be a relatively minor element during the 1860s, 70s. But when you look at what Alaska is up to, you see that we have a desperate need for gold. In the 1890s, we're going to find a gigantic gold strike up in the Yukon, up in Alaska, and that's going to solve a lot of our gold issues. And so that's the way that the Alaska thing is going to come back full circle, is it's going to help us with our currency problems that we're having with the gold standard. How did Cleveland get elected with so much hatred towards Democrats? Really good question. Keep in mind with Cleveland, it's the mugwumps, stalwarts, and half-breeds. You've got the mugwumps and the half-breeds who both want reform. They're going to end up splitting the Republican Party in half. So think back to 1860, where you had the Democrats tear each other in half, Northern and Southern, because they can't get on the same page about what should be going on with the Civil War and the treatment of Lincoln and slavery. We see the same thing going on with the Republicans, that they divide themselves enough that it opens the door for Cleveland to come storming through. Then when Harrison becomes president, he is everything that reformers hate, where he is the traditional Gilded Age president who is taking care of all of his friends, doing a number of different things that seem pretty corrupt or just not really sensitive to what's happening to the poor people, especially his nativism, where you've got like the anti-alcohol push, and you've got the mandatory English in schools, and you've got all these different movements inside the Republican Party that open up the door again for Grover Cleveland in 1892. So during that time period, that's what's going to open the door for Cleveland. But largely, these are pro-Republican times. What were the effects of the Compromise of 1877? The Compromise of 1877 is going to end Reconstruction. The military gets pulled out, and they're going to be moved up into the north to suppress Union efforts, and also moved out west to attack Native Americans in advance of Western settlement. Compromise of 1877 also will stop any sort of forward momentum going on with Reconstruction, and so it'll just bring all that stuff to a halt. Next question. Sherman Silver Purchase Act. What was going on with that? So when you think about the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, essentially what you have is something to replace the Bland-Allison Act that came previously. So we had early in the chapter a Bland-Allison Act that is just taking little amounts of silver and buying it from miners to help encourage that business. It's meant to kind of be a bone that they're throwing to farmers, but it doesn't really do much to inflate the currency. When you move on to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the government starts buying more silver, and they also start then turning that into coins. When they start doing that, there's a hope that farmers have that they'll be able to start increasing the money supply, inflating it so that they're able to make more money, so they're able to have more money out there so their prices can keep increasing. Give me just a second, guys. I think I'm going to be done in time. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So what the Sherman Silver Purchase Act is supposed to be doing is it's increasing the money supply so that then hopefully the farmers are going to get some relief, but it's not built to be that effective with that goal. It's still going to be just a limited amount of silver that they're purchasing, that they're turning into currency, at least at the beginning. They also create a ratio of 16 pieces of silver is equal to 1 piece of gold. And so what I'd like you to do is, like we mentioned in class today, there's an equation that you want to have when you're studying this in this chapter. We're also going to bounce back to it when we get to chapter 26, right after winter break, and we're dealing with the West. But the equation is 16 pieces of silver is equal to 1 piece of gold, and it's equal to 1 greenback. And the reason why the Sherman Silver Purchase Act is such a big deal is for the farmers, even though it's not effective, they think that the purchase of silver by the federal government and turning it into coins is their magic solution to all their problems. If they can just inflate the money supply, they'll make prices go up. It'll make it easier for them to pay back their loans. And the problem is the Panic of 1893. So like we talked about in class, stock market fails, banks fail, businesses fail, the entire economy starts crashing. But the Sherman Silver Purchase Act is going to make all this stuff worse. Because what happened was, in the late 1800s, when they created the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, we were done finding gold for a while. It's not going to be until Alaska that we really see another gigantic gold strike. Meanwhile, we keep increasing the amount of silver because they find silver in like the Comstock lode out west and other sorts of silver strikes. And so we have more and more silver that's coming into our money supply, but our gold stays capped. So what should have happened, like we discussed today, is the idea that that equation should have been tweaked. The idea of having a greenback for a piece of gold was great when the economy was fine, but when we crashed the economy in 1893, we already know everybody's going to flip out and panic. They don't trust paper money ever since the time period of Jackson. They know that people in the government have hated paper money, and so when the Panic of 1893 comes, everybody's going to take their greenbacks and cash that in for gold. And since we haven't been finding any additional gold, that gold is now lost, and so the government doesn't have gold for its gold standard in that way. The other problem, though, is we should have probably changed our ratio, so it shouldn't have still been 16 pieces of silver for one piece of gold. The whole silver to gold ratio is out of whack. It should be like 32 pieces of silver for a piece of gold, but that's not what the transaction rate is. Because of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act saying it's 16 to 1, you can bring 16 pieces of silver to the United States government and trade it in for one chunk of gold. And that way you're essentially getting a half-off sale. It would be like being able to go to a bank or a store, give them 2 quarters, and they would end up giving you $1. And so the Sherman Silver Purchase Act is going to make a bad situation worse, because now everybody's rushing in with all their extra silver, cashing it in for all the government's gold. And in order for our money supply to work, we have to have gold to back up some, if not all, of our money. Otherwise, nobody's going to trust our cash, and our entire economy is going to fold up. So with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, we have big business people cashing in their money, like J.P. Morgan is making a mint off of trading in his silver for gold. We have foreign countries coming over and doing the exact same thing. And the problem that you have is Grover Cleveland can't easily get rid of this law without it looking like he is then a hard currency person who's for the gold standard. Because for the farmers who don't really understand economics, they've put all of their faith in the idea that a silver standard can fix all of their problems. The problem that Cleveland has, though, is he doesn't have time to wait, because if he waits just a few more weeks, the entire government gold supply will be gone. And so he has to make 2 decisions that are going to make him very unpopular. Number one, he is going to get rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which is going to seem like a betrayal to farmers. And in fact, in the next coming few chapters, you're going to see the farmers go absolutely crazy about the idea of now not doing a Bland Allison Act or a Sherman Silver Purchase Act, but they instead want to have an unlimited coinage of silver, where any chunk of silver brought to the government gets turned into money. They want to create something called bimetallism, where we use gold or silver for our money supply and have them be interchangeable. The other element that really bothers farmers is the fact that J.P. Morgan has been making money off of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. He's got a gigantic bank, which many farmers don't trust from the time period of like Thomas Jefferson and the bus. He also is in the process of buying up all these railroads out west that are getting into financial difficulties. So J.P. Morgan is the worst enemy for the farmers who are out west, but he's the leading banker in the United States, and he's sitting on a mountain of cash, largely because he's been taking gold out of the United States treasury, and now he's sitting on tons of it. So Grover Cleveland, Grover the Good, the guy who's supposed to be doing all this stuff to root out corruption, he has to go to J.P. Morgan, beg him for help, and J.P. Morgan doesn't give money to the government because he's a banker. He's there to make cash. He will lend it back to the government a lot of the gold that he has been able to pull out. He also convinces his European friends to stop cashing out gold as well, and that happens until the Sherman Silver Purchase Act goes away. J.P. Morgan's able to give a loan of $60+ million worth of gold, but he's going to want that back with interest. And it brings a lot of people to the question of, during the Panic of 1893, is it good for us to have one rich banker in the United States who understands the system better than anybody because of the fact that he's working with politicians to create laws that will keep his monopoly safe? And is it good for the idea that the entire government is dependent on this one person to be in a good mood to help bail out the country? For people who like a weaker central government, the answer is absolutely yes. For people who want a stronger government, that's a little bit of a scary proposition, because if J.P. Morgan on that day said, you know what, I'm not interested in helping out today, the question then becomes, what happens to the government? And so that's the problem that you have with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and what J.P. Morgan is up to, is with the Panic of 1893, we crashed the economy with farms, banks, stock market, businesses, and the government itself. And you've got a bunch of people in our country who have watched the economy now crash repeatedly, wiping out all their life savings. But many people are looking down on them for being poor because of the fact that they're claiming that they're genetically worse because they're not as good as the rich people in society. So that's going to set up a lot of the problems we're going to see in the next few chapters, where, like I mentioned, we're in a divide sectionally in our country, not north and south over slavery, but instead rich versus poor as far as what our monetary policy, government policies, and that stuff should be like. So let me take a look and see here. Looks like that's my last question that I had from you guys tonight. That is perfect timing because now I can take my boy up to basketball. If you do have any other questions, I'll be checking emails throughout the night, so feel free to hit me with any sort of emails or come see me before class tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow is going to be your Chapter 22 and 23 test. On Wednesday will be our third and final 50 states test. And then also we'll start moving into Chapter 24. So whenever you're ready to transition into that material, feel free to do so that we're able to deal with that. But otherwise, thanks for being with me tonight. And if you're checking this out later on, hopefully your review goes well. Have a good night, you guys.